Daniel couldn't have anticipated the moment his life would unravel. It began with a conversation that cut deeper than he thought possible, followed by a scene that shattered his trust completely. Watching his wife Grace sitting casually on his best friend Eric's lap, her smirk twisted the knife in his heart. That night, the marriage certificate lay in tatters, and his wedding ring clinked to the floor at her feet as he walked out, leaving behind the life he had known. But this was not the end. It was the start of Daniel's transformation. The celebration at Daniel and Grace's home was lively, filled with friends and family gathered to mark their 12th wedding anniversary. The living room buzzed with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and cheerful conversation. Grace's bright smile seemed to light up the room as she mingled with guests, while their children played noisily upstairs with their cousins. The scene was picture perfect, like something out of a family movie. "Daniel, honey, could you grab the wine from the kitchen?" Grace called out, her smile warm but not reaching her eyes. "Sure, give me a minute," Daniel replied, weaving through the guests. As he glanced back at her, he felt a swell of gratitude for the life they had built, completely unaware of the truth waiting to ambush him. In the kitchen, as Daniel uncorked the wine, the sound of muffled voices from the hallway caught his attention. His mother's usually calm tone was sharp, tinged with urgency. "Are you crazy?" she hissed. "Daniel could hear you. He might catch you." Daniel froze, his pulse quickening. What could she possibly mean? Then Grace's voice followed, sharp and venomous. "Catch us? What's he going to do? Cry about it?" she sneered. "He's just a pathetic wallet. I don't care what that loser thinks." Each word hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. His breath quickened as confusion and anger churned in his chest. Fighting the growing dread, he moved closer, his heart pounding. He had to see it for himself. In the hallway, the sight before him confirmed his worst fears. Grace was perched on Eric's lap, her fingers lazily twirling his hair, her expression carefree. When Grace turned and locked eyes with him, she didn't look panicked or ashamed, only defiant. Her smirk deepened. "Oh, grow up, loser. Yeah, we're together," she said, her tone dripping with scorn. "What are you going to do about it?" Daniel clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. But before he could respond, Grace's voice took on a dangerous edge. "If you even think about divorcing me, you'll never see your kids again," she warned. Eric, pale and stammering, tried to interject. "It's not like that, man. We didn't mean—" "Shut up," Daniel snapped, his voice icy and unyielding. For the first time, he didn't falter. Something within him shattered, but in its place, something unbreakable began to grow. His gaze shifted to his mother, who stood a few steps away, guilt written across her face. Realization dawned. She had known all along. "You knew about this," Daniel said, his voice rising with each word. "Didn't you? How long, Mom? How long have you been covering for them?" His mother flinched, wringing her hands as she stammered. "Daniel, it's not like that. Let's just go back to the party." "Don't lie to me," he thundered, his voice filled with betrayal and rage. Years of trust and love for his mother crumbled under the weight of her silence. Back in the kitchen, Daniel's mind raced, the gravity of the betrayal pressing down on him. His trembling hands reached into a drawer, pulling out their wedding certificate. He stared at it, the ornate letters once symbolizing their vows now mocking him. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "This was supposed to mean something," he muttered, the bitterness in his voice cutting through the air. What a joke! Without hesitation, he tore the document in half, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. Piece by piece, he shredded it until it was nothing more than scattered remnants of a broken promise. His wedding ring caught his eye, glinting under the fluorescent light. The sight of it made his stomach turn. Pulling it off with shaking fingers, he stormed back into the hallway. Grace and Eric were still there, their conversation halting abruptly as Daniel approached. Without a word, he threw the ring at Grace's feet. The metallic clink echoed loudly in the tense silence. "Congratulations," he said, his voice laced with venom. "You two deserve each other." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then Grace smirked, crossing her arms. "Oh, what are you going to do now? Cry about it? Run away like you always do?" she taunted. But Daniel didn't rise to the bait. His icy stare met hers unwavering. He didn't need to argue. The truth was already laid bare, and nothing she said could diminish the depth of her betrayal. Turning on his heel, he walked past them, leaving the house without another word. The cold night air hit him as he stepped outside, slamming the door behind him. His heart pounded, anger and pain warring within him. He had no idea where he was going, but anywhere was better than staying in that house, that lie of a home. Behind him, he could still hear Grace's voice, muffled but mocking, her laughter cutting through the night like a cruel taunt. But Daniel kept walking, refusing to let her words take root. For the first time in years, something stirred within him, a spark of resolve. Grace had already taken so much from him, but she wouldn't take his dignity. With each step, Daniel felt a growing determination. This was the end of one chapter, but it was also the start of something new. The moment Daniel stepped away from the house, the crushing weight on his shoulders began to ease, if only slightly. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't let Grace destroy what was left of his life. Inside the now eerily quiet house, Daniel sat alone in his office, the dim glow of his phone illuminating his face. As he scrolled through the endless stream of photos, each swipe deepened the ache in his chest. Snapshots of birthdays, anniversaries, and family vacations filled the screen, images of what he had believed to be moments of pure happiness. In every photo, Grace's smile radiated warmth as she held him or their children close. How could it have all been a lie? One particular image caught his attention. His thumb hovered over the screen, frozen. It was from their 10th anniversary, a picture of them standing on the beach, arms tightly around one another. His smile was genuine, full of pride and love. But now, staring at Grace's expression, he saw something he had missed before. There was a detachment in her eyes masked by the tilt of her head and her practiced smile. "How did I not see this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. "How did I let it get this far?" Memories of subtle warning signs surfaced, glaringly obvious in hindsight. Her frequent nights out with friends, her dismissive tone whenever he expressed concern, the way she shrugged off his discomfort with Eric's growing presence in their lives. One memory cut sharper than the rest: the night he had voiced his unease about how close she seemed to Eric. "You're paranoid," she had said with a scoff, her voice dripping with disdain. "Eric's your best friend. Stop being so insecure." Her words echoed in his mind, mocking him. Insecure. That was how she silenced him, how she made him doubt his instincts. And he had believed her. It had been easier to trust her than to confront the possibility of betrayal. Anger surged within him, hot and overwhelming. Before he could stop himself, his fist slammed down on the desk. Pain shot up his arm, anchoring him momentarily. The sharp sound shattered the suffocating silence of the room. Breathing heavily, Daniel leaned forward, his head resting in his hands. Slowly the anger ebbed, replaced by something more resolute. He lifted his head, his jaw set. Sitting here, drowning in self-pity, wasn't going to change anything. Grace's betrayal had already taken so much from him, he wouldn't let it steal his future. He set his phone down with steady hands. Reflection time was over. He had decisions to make, actions to take. This wasn't the end. It was the start of something new, something stronger. Straightening in his chair, he took a deep breath. For the first time that night, a flicker of determination cut through the darkness. The next morning, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the contact information of a lawyer he had saved months ago, but never thought he'd need. Hesitating for only a moment, he exhaled sharply and tapped the number. The phone rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. "This is Claire Matthews. How can I help you?" Daniel introduced himself, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. He summarized the events of the previous night, his words clipped but deliberate. Claire listened intently, her professionalism grounding him amidst the chaos of his thoughts. "Adultery cases can be challenging, Daniel," she began with measured confidence. "But based on what you've described, you have a strong case. Our priority will be protecting your children. Grace won't be able to use them as leverage." Her words felt like a lifeline. "What do I need to do next?" Daniel asked, bracing himself for the battle ahead. "Start documenting everything," Claire instructed firmly. "Texts, emails, social media activity, anything that supports the affair. If you can find financial records or receipts showing questionable spending, gather those too. And if you have access to security footage, that could be invaluable." Daniel nodded, resolve hardening in his expression. "I'll get started immediately." In the days that followed, Daniel threw himself into the task. Each piece of evidence was like a fresh wound, but he pushed through, knowing it was necessary. He began with Grace's phone, which she often left charging in the kitchen. Trust was no longer an option. One evening, while she was upstairs, he scrolled through her messages. What he found only deepened the betrayal. Text exchanges with Eric brimming with arrogance and cruelty. Guri, I can't wait to see you tonight. He's clueless as always. What's he going to do? He's too soft to take action. Daniel's jaw tightened as he forwarded the messages to his own phone, carefully erasing any signs of his intrusion. Next, he combed through bank statements from their shared account, uncovering receipts for expensive dinners and hotel stays, all disguised as work expenses. The pattern painted a damning picture. Social media came next. While neither Grace nor Eric had been brazen enough to post incriminating photos, subtle overlaps in locations and timeframes emerged, clues that in hindsight were painfully obvious. Finally, he reviewed their home security footage. Installed years ago for safety, it now revealed intimate moments between Grace and Eric on nights Daniel had been working late. The raw evidence was undeniable, cutting through any lingering disbelief. Though the process was grueling, Daniel didn't waver. Each discovery fueled his determination to ensure Grace wouldn't manipulate the situation, especially when it came to their children. When he met with Claire again, he laid out everything he had gathered. She scanned the evidence with a focused expression, nodding approvingly. "This is solid," she said. "With this, we can secure custody and hold Grace accountable for her actions." For the first time in days, Daniel felt a glimmer of relief. He wasn't powerless. The path ahead was steep, but it was clear. The following morning, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly out the window as sunlight filtered through the curtains. His untouched coffee sat cooling beside him. He knew Grace would come downstairs soon. Confrontation wasn't her style, but controlling the narrative was. Her heels clicked against the floor as she entered the kitchen, her movements deliberate. Dressed impeccably, she leaned casually against the counter, exuding confidence. "So," she began, her tone light but with a hint of irritation, "are we going to talk about your little outburst at the party, or are you just going to keep pouting?" Daniel didn't react immediately, taking a slow sip of his coffee as silence stretched between them. Finally, he set the mug down and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What's there to talk about?" he asked evenly, his tone calm yet detached. Grace rolled her eyes dramatically, letting out an exasperated sigh. Daniel rewrote Grace's dismissive words into fuel for his transformation. "Come on, Daniel, stop acting like a child. Nothing happened with Eric. Your insecurities are absurd," she had scoffed, hoping to belittle him. But her attempt to provoke anger or defensiveness failed. Instead, Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with an unnerving calm. Grace wasn't used to this version of him, one devoid of vulnerability or desperation. "Don't worry, Grace," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "I'm taking steps to change that." She froze mid-sip, lowering her mug slowly, startled by his confidence. Attempting to mask her unease, she scoffed. "Oh, really? And what's that supposed to mean?" Daniel stood, moving deliberately, his gaze locked on hers. The silence stretched until discomfort crept across her features, barely concealed by her usual air of indifference. "It means I'm done being blind," he said at last. "And I'm done letting you walk all over me. Fixing my insecurities starts with holding people accountable." For a split second, Grace's expression faltered before she quickly recovered. "Oh, please," she shot back, her tone sharp. "Don't act like some victim. You've always been exhausting, constantly overthinking, paranoid. You make everything harder than it needs to be." Daniel smiled faintly, unsettling her further. "Maybe I was paranoid," he admitted calmly. "But I was right, and you know it." Grace stared at him, her bravado cracking as the realization set in. This wasn't the Daniel she could manipulate anymore. "Fine, Daniel," she snapped, her voice rising in frustration. "Keep being dramatic. It won't change anything." "You're right, Grace," he replied, stepping closer. "It won't change what you've done, but it'll change everything about what I do next." Her smirk wavered as she searched his face for the man she once controlled, the one who crumbled under pressure. But he was gone. Without another word, Daniel walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with her tightening grip on her mug. Upstairs, the faint sound of their children's laughter filtered down, an ironic reminder of what was truly at stake. As Daniel climbed the stairs, a sense of clarity washed over him. The confrontation solidified what he already knew. He wasn't the weak, insecure man Grace had painted him to be. Trusting her had been foolish, but he refused to let her define his future. Each step strengthened his resolve. This wasn't about his pride or heartbreak anymore. It was about protecting the life he had built for himself and his children. Grace's games were over. In the days that followed, Daniel worked silently, pouring his energy into gathering evidence as advised. Each piece he uncovered brought him closer to reclaiming control, even as it deepened his sense of betrayal. One night, while Grace was out, he accessed their shared cloud storage. His hands trembled as he scrolled through messages, bracing for what he might find. His breath caught when he stumbled upon texts between Grace and Eric. Their mockery cut deep. Eric, he'll never find out. He's too trusting, too soft. Grace, even if he did, he wouldn't do anything. He'd probably just cry about it. The callousness was almost unbearable, but Daniel saved the messages, forwarding them to a secure folder. Each new discovery, bank records, home security footage, gifts disguised as business expenses, fortified his case and chipped away at the life he thought he had. Grace, meanwhile, noticed his change. His silence and composure unnerved her. She prodded for cracks but found none. One evening, as Daniel reviewed financial statements, Grace leaned against the doorway. "Whatever you're planning, it won't work," she said sharply. "You don't have the guts." Daniel didn't look up. Finishing his work, he met her gaze with calm resolve. "Good night, Grace," he said simply. Her smirk faltered, unease flickering in her eyes before she turned away. Daniel's focus remained unshaken. Every document, message, and recording became a piece of the puzzle, revealing the full extent of Grace's betrayal. He backed up files, took meticulous notes, and ensured she couldn't twist the situation to harm him or their children. Though the work was emotionally taxing, it gave him clarity and purpose. He was no longer reacting. He was preparing. Every day brought him closer to freedom, and every taunt from Grace met his quiet determination. She had underestimated him, but that time was over. The living room buzzed with tension as family and friends gathered, their confusion palpable. Grace sat rigid, her composure cracking, while Eric shifted uncomfortably. Daniel stood by the TV, calm yet intense, holding a remote. "You all deserve the truth," he began, his voice steady but edged with resolve. "For too long, I was blind to what was happening right under my nose. Not anymore." He pressed the button, and the screen lit up with home security footage. Grace and Eric appeared, their intimate gestures undeniable. Gasps filled the room, but Daniel's gaze stayed fixed on Grace. Her face paled, her confidence unraveling with each passing second. Grace's voice quivered as she started. "This isn't what it seems. I wasn't thinking clearly. It was a mistake." Daniel's calm demeanor finally broke, anger sparking in his eyes. "A mistake," he shot back, his voice rising. "How long has this been going on? Months? Years?" Grace's mouth opened, but no words came out. She glanced around, searching for support, but the disapproving stares of their family offered no comfort. "We were just—" she stammered, but Daniel cut her off sharply. "Save it," he said coldly. "I have the proof. The texts, the videos, everything. You didn't just betray me, you mocked me, made me a fool in front of everyone, and even dragged my mother into it." Desperation crept into Grace's voice as it rose in pitch. "Think of the kids, Daniel. We can go to counseling. We can fix this." Daniel let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Fix this?" he echoed, disbelief dripping from his tone. "Don't insult me. You threatened to take the kids away, to use them against me. You don't want to fix anything. You want control. Well, that ends now. We're done." Grace collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face, but Daniel remained unmoved. He turned his attention to Eric, whose face burned with embarrassment as he sat in silence. "And you," Daniel said, his voice low and icy, "my so-called best friend, how long were you laughing at me behind my back, pretending to care while sneaking around with my wife?" Eric stuttered, raising his hands defensively. "It wasn't like that, man. I didn't mean for it to happen." "Don't," Daniel interrupted, his tone final. "You're not even worth my anger." The harshest blow came when Daniel turned to his mother, seated on the edge of her chair with trembling hands. His expression was unreadable as he addressed her. "And you," he said quietly, though the weight of his words struck harder than any shout. "You knew, didn't you? You chose her lies over your own son." The room fell silent, broken only by the faint murmur of emotion. Tears streamed down his mother's face as she stammered. "I thought I was protecting you, Daniel. I didn't want to see your family fall apart." His voice was void of warmth as he replied, "It fell apart the moment you chose to protect them instead of me." Silence returned, heavier this time. Grace sobbed quietly, Eric hung his head, and his mother wept openly. Daniel turned off the TV, stepping back with slow, measured breaths. "This is the truth," he said firmly, addressing the room. "You've all seen it now. No more lies, no more manipulation. Grace, Eric, Mom, whatever you thought you could get away with, it's over." Without another word, Daniel walked to the door, his steps purposeful and steady. He didn't need apologies, excuses, or explanations. He had said everything he needed to, and for the first time in months, he felt at peace. Though the weight of their betrayal remained, their power over him was gone. He was free. The courtroom was cold and imposing, the only sounds the rustling of papers and hushed conversations between lawyers. Daniel sat at his table, his posture straight, his face calm and resolute. Across the room, Grace sat beside her lawyer, her previous confidence replaced by thinly veiled anxiety. The overwhelming evidence against her left little room for defense. The proceedings moved swiftly. Daniel's lawyer, Claire, presented the evidence with precision: security footage, financial records, and incriminating texts that left no doubt about Grace's infidelity. The judge's questions were direct, and Grace's attempts to minimize her actions fell flat. Her lawyer's arguments for shared custody and alimony were dismantled by Claire's unwavering rebuttals. By the end, the ruling was decisive. Daniel was granted full custody of their children, with Grace allowed only limited supervised visitation. Her alimony request was denied. The evidence of her betrayal made support unjustifiable. As the gavel struck, signaling the hearing's end, Daniel felt a sense of closure. In the hallway, Grace approached him, her red-rimmed eyes and trembling voice betraying her desperation. "Please, Daniel," she said softly, "let's not drag this out any further. We can find a way to work through it." Daniel met her gaze, his expression unflinching. He took a deep breath and replied with deliberate calm, "You dragged it out when you chose Eric over me and the kids. You made your choices, Grace. Now you'll have to live with them." Her face crumpled, but Daniel didn't linger. Her words, which had once held power over him, now felt hollow, echoes of a life he was leaving behind. Meanwhile, Eric's downfall was swift and catastrophic. His wife, Michelle, wasted no time filing for divorce after uncovering not only his affair with Grace, but also other indiscretions. Fueled by anger and determination, she exposed his misconduct at work, including falsified expense reports and inappropriate behavior with colleagues. The fallout was devastating. Eric lost his job, his reputation shattered, and his financial stability crumbled. Grace and Eric's actions became a cautionary tale among their social circle, their once comfortable lives in ruins. Grace's attempts to mend relationships were met with cold indifference, while Eric's former colleagues distanced themselves to avoid association with his tarnished name. For Daniel, the aftermath was bittersweet. Winning custody of his children brought relief and validation. He focused on building a stable, loving home for them, prioritizing their happiness and well-being. Yet, an undeniable grief lingered: the loss of the family he had once believed in, and the betrayal by those he had trusted. Even in his sorrow, there was hope. His children began to smile more, their laughter filling the house again. The weight of uncertainty lifted as they adjusted to their new normal, finding comfort in Daniel's unwavering presence. Slowly, their lives began to piece back together. For Grace and Eric, the road ahead was uncertain. Their choices had cost them everything: relationships, reputations, and the stability they had once taken for granted. Daniel didn't dwell on their misfortune. His focus remained on rebuilding a life filled with purpose, integrity, and the unconditional love of his children. The scars of betrayal stayed with him, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they were proof of his resilience and strength in starting anew. In the months that followed, Daniel and his children quietly rebuilt their lives. Though the wounds of the past remained, their home transformed into a place of warmth and laughter. Daniel devoted himself fully to his children, attending their school events, coaching soccer games, and cherishing family movie nights. The change was evident. Their smiles grew brighter and their laughter more frequent. When questions about Grace arose, Daniel answered with honesty and compassion, always emphasizing their happiness and stability as his priorities. Daniel wasn't just mending himself. He was guiding his children through their own healing. One afternoon, while picking up his youngest from an after-school art class, he encountered Amelia. Her warmth was immediately apparent, her kind smile effortlessly putting others at ease. Amelia, the art teacher, had a passion for creativity that shone through in the way she engaged with the children. Their first meeting was friendly and lighthearted, marked by her easy confidence. Over time, casual greetings evolved into deeper conversations. Daniel found himself looking forward to seeing her, drawn to her presence, which stood in stark contrast to the chaos he had endured. Amelia was genuine, grounded, and kind, everything he had once thought impossible. Their bond grew naturally without urgency, as both seemed to recognize the significance of what was forming. Daniel was struck by Amelia's ability to connect with his children. Her patience and kindness made her an effortless fit in their family dynamic. She introduced them to new creative outlets, painting afternoons in the yard and crafts on rainy days. The children adored her, and her presence brought balance and stability into their lives. Amelia respected Daniel's need for space to process his emotions, offering quiet support without judgment. She reminded him of his value through her unwavering encouragement, their connection deepening with every shared moment. One evening, after Amelia had helped prepare a family meal, Daniel watched her interact with his kids. Her laughter mingled with theirs, her ease and warmth blending seamlessly into their lives. In that moment, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years: hope. Amelia wasn't just a source of love and support. She was proof that life could be rebuilt, that happiness could thrive again. Together, they began to shape a future built on trust, love, and the lessons of the past. In the quiet weeks after the court ruling, Daniel faced the lingering shadows of his past. Grace was the first to approach him, her desperation evident as she arrived unannounced one evening. The children were upstairs, unaware of the exchange taking place below. "I just need your forgiveness," Grace pleaded, her voice unsteady. "Please, Daniel, I've lost everything. I'm trying to make it right." Leaning against the doorframe, Daniel's gaze was steady and firm. He studied her, weighing her words before responding. "Forgiveness isn't something you demand, Grace," he said, his tone calm but unyielding. "It's something you earn. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever be able to give it to you." Grace's expression crumbled, but Daniel remained composed. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," he continued. "I just need you to understand that some things can't be undone. I've moved on, and I think you should too." Her shoulders sagged as she nodded, the finality in his voice leaving no room for argument. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the night. Daniel closed the door and stood still, exhaling deeply. The encounter stirred emotions he thought he'd put to rest, but the sound of his children's laughter upstairs grounded him. Grace no longer held any power over him, and that was a victory he intended to keep. A week later, his mother reached out, seeking forgiveness of her own. She invited him to meet for coffee, her message hesitant and apologetic. Curious more than anything, Daniel agreed. They sat across from one another in a quiet cafe, the tension between them almost palpable. "I don't know where to begin," she said, clutching her coffee cup tightly. "I made a terrible mistake, Daniel. I thought I was protecting you by staying silent, by trying to hold everything together. But I see now that I only made things worse." Her voice broke, and tears filled her eyes. "I can't undo what I did, but I hope that someday you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." Daniel listened, his emotions conflicted. He had trusted his mother deeply, but her complicity in Grace's betrayal left wounds that wouldn't heal easily. Taking a deep breath, he spoke with a mix of softness and resolve. "I appreciate your honesty," he said, "but forgiveness isn't something I can give right now. I need time, Mom, to figure out what our relationship looks like moving forward." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I understand," she whispered. "I just hope we can find our way back to each other one day." The conversation ended on a note of cautious hope. As Daniel drove home, he felt a sense of closure beginning to settle. Those who had hurt him most sought his forgiveness, but he realized forgiveness was as much for himself as it was for them. He wouldn't rush the process or offer absolution on their terms. Healing was his journey, and he would move at his own pace. Back home, Amelia greeted him with a warm smile, her steady presence grounding him. Joining his children at the dinner table, Daniel was reminded that his focus was no longer on those who had broken his trust, but on those who had earned it. The scars remained, but they no longer defined him. He had found peace, and that was enough. The spring morning was bright and full of promise, a symbol of new beginnings. In a sunlit garden surrounded by family and close friends, Daniel stood at the altar. Amelia walked toward him, radiant in a simple white dress, her smile brimming with the quiet confidence that had drawn him to her. The atmosphere was alive with joy, a stark contrast to the darkness he had once endured. As they exchanged vows, Daniel's heart swelled with gratitude he couldn't put into words. Amelia wasn't just a partner. She embodied everything he thought he'd lost. Her kindness, her patience with his children, and her unwavering belief in him had given him the courage to trust again. Sliding the ring onto her finger, Daniel felt a profound sense of renewal, as though his journey had always been leading him to this moment. Later, as the festivities wound down, Daniel and Amelia sat together under a canopy of string lights. His children played nearby, their laughter carried on the breeze. Turning to Amelia, his voice thick with emotion, he said, "I wouldn't have made it without you." Amelia smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "You just needed someone to remind you of who you are," she replied gently. "The rest was always in you." Her words settled in his heart. As Daniel reflected on the path that had brought him here, the pain of Grace and Eric's betrayal felt like a distant memory, its sharp edges dulled by time. He realized their actions, though devastating, had spurred his transformation. Without them, he might never have rebuilt himself or found the clarity to recognize the love he deserved. Watching Amelia and his children, Daniel understood something he hadn't before. The best revenge wasn't in witnessing Grace and Eric suffer the consequences of their choices. It wasn't rooted in bitterness or anger. True revenge was living a life so full of love, joy, and purpose that their betrayal no longer mattered. It was rising above the pain to create something beautiful in its place. In that moment, Daniel felt a profound peace. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his, shaped by resilience, filled with genuine love, and surrounded by people who truly mattered. As the stars dotted the night sky, Daniel leaned back with a quiet smile. The past no longer held him captive. The future stretched before him, a blank canvas waiting to be filled. His story, once defined by heartbreak, had become one of renewal and strength, a lesson in the power of growth and the beauty that can emerge from pain.